Hello again. In this lesson we'll start with getting more familiar with the various windows in Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition. We'll work with many of the standard user interface controls from the toolbox. And finally we'll modify the properties of those controls to change the way they appear and behave within our applications. Now throughout this series of lessons I'll be referring to this program's user interface as an IDE. An IDE stands for Interactive Development Environment. It's a genre of software that assists you in creating your own programs. Now there's a lot of IDEs out there depending on the vendor and the programming language, but if you want to create Visual Basic applications, then Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition is the default IDE, especially if you're just getting started. As you advance and become part of a team and a corporate environment, your company may supply you with Visual Studio 2005 Professional or an even more advanced version that integrates with Team System. Now that's a little down the road at this point, but I wanted you to understand what an IDE is and the relationship between Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition and its big brother Visual Studio 2005. A good IDE will provide lots of tools that help you to create applications more easily. Now in the previous example in Lesson 1, we just dragged and dropped a button control from the toolbox into place on a Visual Designer. Now what we saw on the Designer surface looked exactly like the form that the end user would see whenever running our application. We didn't have to write code to draw the form, to make it the correct size, to position it on the screen. We didn't have to write code to position the button at the exact spot on the form, but something wrote that code because virtually everything that you do in Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition, whether you realize it or not, is writing code for you. So when we double-clicked on the button to write code to display the message box, the act of double-clicking on the button generated code. You remember the what we call the event handler, which we were going to talk about later? And these are just a few examples of how the IDE helps you to write applications much faster than if you were to try and type all the code yourself into Notepad, for example, and then compile it manually, which you can do. Now we'll talk about this more in a moment, and we'll actually look at where this code resides that's generated automatically for you in a future lesson. Now there are many tools in Windows in Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition. Some of them help you write code or to configure aspects of your application. Some tools help you find your mistakes. Some tools help you search and locate code that you've written. But all these tools have to appear somewhere on the screen at some point so you can interact with them. And Microsoft has done a pretty good job of putting these tools in clever places so they appear only when you need them and then they get lost whenever you need them to get out of your way. So to demonstrate this, what I want to do is create a new project called Lesson 02. I'm going to select New Project from the File menu. Make sure that Windows Application is selected from the Install Templates, and then change the name to Lesson 02. And click OK, just like we did in the previous lesson. Now that I have my lesson, let's take a look at how to work with the windows that appear within the IDE. And let's take the toolbox for an example. Notice that whenever I hover my mouse cursor over the toolbox tab on the left-hand side, that the toolbox jettisons out, and now I can select which control that I want to use from the list of controls within the toolbox. Just like we saw in the previous lesson, I was able to just drag and drop a button and put it onto my form. That works great if I only need to put a couple of controls onto my form. But this whole process of hovering my mouse cursor over and then waiting for it to pop out and then finding the control that I'm looking for can be burdensome if I need to do that for 10 or 15 controls. I have to wait, find the control I'm looking for, wait for it to close, go back, and so on. What I can do in this case is to turn off the auto hide feature by going to the little pin icon at the top of the menu bar, and selecting it, and notice now that it's fixed into place. And as a result, my main area kind of moves over to the right a little bit to allow for this fixed window to be in place now. If this doesn't work for me, if I need the toolbox in a different area, what I can do is click on the menu bar and drag it off of its default spot and just move it anywhere onto the interface. And notice whenever I drag this around that these little visual helpers that will help me find the right spot in order to drop it. So if I want to put it back in place, all I need to do is hover my mouse cursor now over this left-hand column icon, and notice that a little blue shaded area shows me where the window will actually be placed once I drop it there. Or I can do this against the top or against the side. And when I go to this side, notice that I get some options here. I can put it here, or I can put it there, and so on. Now I'm just going to put it back into place for now. Now over here on the right-hand side, we have a different representation. Notice that the window is pinned down, so there's no auto hide, but we have these tabs that are at the bottom, and so right now I see the Solution Explorer, but I can also view other windows by clicking on the little tabs in the bottom of each section. And you'll notice that this column is split up into two rows or two areas. I have the Solution Explorer and the data sources windows docked in this upper section, and then below it I have this properties window. Now I could rip this off as well and place it along with, whoops, I didn't do it quite right there. Let's do it one more time. I can try and place it with the rest of these windows here, and notice now that the Solution Explorer takes up the entire right-hand column. The Properties window, when I click its tab, takes up the entire right-hand column, as does the Data Sources tab. And to get this back into the original position, what I want to do, whoops, is be careful here, and just grab the tab and then find its spot and put it back into place. So now we have the Solution Explorer, the Data Sources, and the Properties window back into its original configuration. So there's a lot of flexibility here to move things around and put them in places where they make the most sense for us. And we can dock them against the left, the right-hand side, the top side, or the bottom side. Now it's important to note that you can only move a window if it's already pinned down. So for example, if I were to remove the auto hide by unpinning this window, and now it's auto hiding again, I can't drag this from its place. I have to first pin it down and then drag it away, and then I can drop it back into place if I want to. Now I've only demonstrated the left and the right hand side. However, there's other windows that have an affinity for different areas for a more horizontal alignment within the IDE, such as the Errors window. And to find this window, I'm going to select the View menu and click the error list, and notice that it displays in dock to the bottom. If I were to try to put this, for example, over here, this wouldn't really be prudent for it to be here because there's so much information that's displayed in a more tabular format, and I would be missing most of the information off to the right-hand side. I'd have to scroll to use it. So it's not always prudent or expedient to put some windows in certain places. They have an affinity for a certain area, and that's probably where we should leave them. And to close a window, all we'll do is select the Close button, the X, in the upper right-hand corner. And as I showed earlier, if you need to access it again, you can go to the View menu and find just about any of the windows. The toolbox, for example, you can see here we have the Solution Explorer, the Database Explorer, the Properties window is somewhere here as well. We can find all of these windows here in this View menu. So if you ever lose them, you can get back to them through the View menu. Okay, that should be enough for now. Let's move on to learning more about creating cool user interfaces for our WinForms applications. In the previous lesson, we've already seen how you can drag and drop controls from the toolbox onto your form, but you can also just double-click a control, for example the button, and it will appear on the form. Also, notice in the toolbox that the controls are nicely arranged by their type. We have, for example, the common controls, container controls, menus and toolbars, data, components, printing, dialogues, and so on. And as I've just demonstrated, you can collapse or to hide the groups of controls that you won't use very often, or you can expand the ones that you'll use often by using the little plus and minus buttons that toggle on and off to the left-hand side of the grouping within the toolbox. Now we'll be looking at the common controls and the menus and toolbars for the remainder of this video and pretty much throughout the remainder of the videos within this series of lessons. Now once a control has been placed on the form, you can also move the control around, you can resize it, and you can try to position it, and notice that you get some automatic features within the Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition that allows you to align things in a very nice way. Notice here that I get this little blue line that comes out so that I can align the left-hand sides or the right-hand sides, the tops or the bottoms, if I can get it to do that. Yes. Let's go ahead and just delete this button off by selecting it and then hit the delete button on our keyboard. You can see that it's gone now. Now, if you really want to control or change how your control looks and how it functions, you're going to have to write some code. Now, do you always have to type in the code yourself? Well, not always, and that's where the Properties window comes in. The Properties window allows us to change the properties, how the control appears, its text, its color, its size. We can control how it functions. Can it be dragged and dropped? Can it be resized as the form is resized? Should it be disabled? And a lot more. Each control has some common properties, but each control also has a few properties that are unique to just that control. That's what makes each control important in your toolbox. They're each just a little bit different. But the good news is that you can count on certain properties to be common across all the controls. It's then just a matter of finding those properties that make each of them a little bit different and learning their strengths and weaknesses. And that just takes a little bit of time and practice, but I'm sure you're going to pick it up very quickly. Now, like I mentioned earlier in this lesson, every time you make a change in the Properties window, behind the scenes the IDE is making a change to the underlying code. And we're going to talk about that in a later lesson. I'll show you where that happens and how to modify that code. Alright, but for now let's take a little diversion and just play around with the button control just to illustrate some of the common properties across most of the controls within your toolbox. So let's take our Properties window and make it a little bit bigger by dragging its title bar up, and so we can see more of our Properties window. And first of all, let's adjust the size of our button. And what we'll do is go to the size property and expand the little plus sign that's next to the word size. And this gives us the ability to change the width and the height. I'll change this width to maybe something like 200 and its height to something like, I don't know, 75 or so. And then I can also change the location. So we'll move this over, its X property over to like 100, for example. Maybe we'll change that even to 50. And we can adjust the Y, or its movement from top to bottom, as well to 50. So now it's 50 pixels from the top and 50 pixels from the side. It's also 200 pixels wide and 75 pixels tall. The next thing that I want to do is change the name of the button. So what we'll usually do is use a descriptive name for the controls that appear on our form. Now, there's several different standards for naming controls. You'll often see something like this used, a three-letter combination that indicates that this is a button control, for example. You might see something like BTN OK. There's also another style that says OK button, like something like that. And that's a style that we'll be using throughout this series of lessons. But be aware that different companies and different individuals have different ways or methods of naming things, and those are called naming standards within the programming world. So we can change the name, and this is going to be how we refer to this instance of the button within our form. We'll talk about instances in the next lesson or the lesson after that. But for now, we're naming this particular button OK button. But by changing the name of the button, it doesn't change what text is displayed on the button. And to change that, we'll have to use the text property. So I'm going to scroll up a little bit and find the text property, which is currently set to button 1. And we might change this to something like OK. Now, I might want to change the color of the button, and I can adjust that by changing the appearance. For example, the back color, and maybe we'll change this to something funky. We'll use a custom color, and we'll use this little lavender color here to change the background color. We can also change the font from its default to something that's much larger, maybe like an 18-point font that is also bold, and we can even italicize it if we want to. And we can change the color of the text by changing the forecolor property. Let's go ahead and change that to something custom as well. We'll make that a nice deep green color, okay? So now we have this real funky looking button that we've just created. And you might be tempted whenever you're creating your applications to put a lot of your own personality into it. However, there's some best practices that you should follow whenever you're learning about building user interfaces. And basically, a best practice is a tried and true method that many people who have come before you have either had success with or have failed at. So it's like learning from other people's successes and failures. You know, there's an old saying that I love: any fool can learn from his own mistakes, but a wise man learns from the mistakes of others. And that's very true in many areas of your life, and is also true as a software developer. And I'm going to give you 3 best practices for user interface design that'll get you a long way. Now keep in mind that there are actually entire books on this subject, so you're not going to be an expert at the end of this lesson, but you're going to have a couple of guidelines to get you started. First of all, think in terms of columns and rows. Whenever you're arranging your controls, try to make sure that they follow a logical pattern. If you're trying to build a data entry form, or a form that allows users to change the properties of your application, attempt to keep the labels in one column on the left, and then keep the controls where the data will be entered and modified on the right. Keep the action buttons like OK, Apply, and Cancel in the lower right-hand corner of the form. The second best practice is to stay with standard fonts and standard colors. Yes, we've all been there before. We all want to be creative, and we all want to pick colors that really jump out at the end user, instead of just using that old gray or tan color that's the default whenever we're building our applications. However, your applications will probably look a lot more professional if you keep them simple, using the standard colors and the standard fonts. Now, true, some consumer or media applications like Windows Media Player, for example, have very cool skins. So it depends on your audience to some degree what type of application you're trying to build. But by sticking to the standards, your end user will have some level of familiarity with how your program operates, because after all, it looks like all the other applications that the user has already worked with. And this is a big plus in terms of usability of your application. Usability is how easy is it for your end user to actually work with your application. Now, third and finally, use standard or descriptive names for your controls. And this applies especially to your buttons. Stick with OK rather than do it or go. Be simple and succinct in your labels. Don't try too hard to be funny or cute. Don't make your users think too hard. And again, this hampers the ability of your end users to understand how your program is intended to be used. So stick with the basics. And there's a lot more that I could say, but let's move on. Let's take a quick tour of about a dozen of the most important controls that you'll find yourself using on just about every project that you work on. In fact, we're going to use most of these controls in our RSS Reader project at the end of this series of lessons. Okay, so I've deleted the controls off the designer surface so I could demonstrate the creation of a fictitious customer service or sales inquiry application. Now, it won't really do anything, but it'll give us a way to introduce some of the common controls in a common scenario. For example, let's go ahead and first talk about the button, which we've seen in the previous video. I'm going to drag 2 of them out here. And a button allows the user to indicate that he wants to take some kind of action within your application. So we want to initiate something, either OK or a cancel, for example. So let's rename the text on these from button 1 to OK, and from button 2 we'll change that to cancel. Now the next thing that we'll use is several label controls. And a label is a control that allows us to put information that's like helper text on the screen. And so they're often used to put a description of an input area. And typically the label will be on the left-hand side, and then the accompanying control will be on the right-hand side. So let's drag off several labels here. And again, we're using this little lineup feature, this little blue line that helps us get them lined up correctly. And I don't know, we'll need probably about 4 of these. So let's go ahead and drag them out. Maybe move them over just a little bit. And change the text in here. And again, we want to use a customer service application. So maybe we'll start with a customer name and the service representative that's working with them. And then we'll use the product that they're interested in. And then their gender. Okay. Now the next control that we're going to look at is a text box. So let's find the text box here. I think there we go. I'm going to drag that into place here on our form. And a text box allows us to accept text input. And so this is great whenever there are virtually unlimited number of possible responses that the user can input into this input area. But it's not good for things like states or countries or yes or no. Those are standard responses. We'll want to restrict the user's ability to input some of that information. But for example, a name, there are so many names in the world, obviously we couldn't use another type of control to allow them to type in the name. So we're going to use a text box for that. The next thing that we're going to use is a checkbox, and I'm going to actually put that at the very bottom of our form here. And a checkbox now is great for yes or no or on or off type questions. Or whenever they're using a group, it's good for multiple choice when more than one answer can be selected. Now in our scenario, we may just want to check and make sure that should we send a catalog to this person. So notice that this particular control has its own built-in label. So we're going to put send catalog. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about the radio button. It's a lot like the checkbox, except that it either allows one selection or another selection, whatever's in that group of radio buttons. So it too has this little label that's off to the right-hand side. So we'll put here like male or female, because those are the only 2 options. There we go. So again, a radio button is great for multiple choice when only one answer can be selected. The next thing we're going to use is a list box. And we may need to rearrange some things here on our form. Yeah. So let's just take a few moments here and drag this down a little bit. I'm going to multi-select these buttons by just placing my mouse cursor and pointing in an area that has nothing in it, and then dragging and dropping this little caret around these 2 controls. Now I have them both selected, as you can see, and I'll move them both down together. Okay, I'll move my send catalog. I'll move my radio buttons down a little bit. We'll move our label down, kind of line it up, and then we have now our list box. And we'll try to get this aligned here in a more appropriate way. Okay, so we can spend a lot of time just tinkering with our forms, making sure they all line up very nicely. But let's talk about the list box. A list box is great for multiple choice, and it can either be configured to allow one selection or multiple selections. And there's a special property that allows us to configure this called selection mode. And we'll demonstrate how this is used in the next lesson. But also notice with our list box that we're going to use this little helper area that's called a task box for the common tasks that we can perform for that given control. Now in this case, what we want to do is edit the items that are displayed within our list box. So I'm going to click the little edit items link, and it opens up this string collection editor. It allows me to type in a number of items, and again, this list box is being used in order to display a list of products that this customer might be interested in. So we'll type something like foobar and Baz Quirk, using the enter key on my keyboard to go to the next line in order to create a new entry, and we might do widgets and gadgets. Great. And so once I've completed selecting or entering all of the items that will be listed in my list box, I'm going to click the OK button, and then I'll click the little retractable arrow to get rid of our Common Tasks window. And so now you can see we have some products represented. And we can allow the user to select multiple items from this list. If they're interested in FooBar and BASQuark, they can select both of these by using either a combination of the Shift or Control button in combination with our mouse's cursor. Next, I want to use a combo box, and I'm going to use that right here next to our service representative. And a combo box is a lot like a list box, but it also allows the user to type a value into a list instead of just selecting it from a limited set of values. So whenever the user selects this little down arrow here, there will be a list of possible selections. Now we can limit it to only allow selection, or we could also allow the user to type in values here if they don't find an option in the list that suits the entry that they need to make. Now, just like in the list box, what we can do is select the little Common Tasks arrow and select Edit Items so we can enter the names of our customer service representatives. We'll put Bob, Beth, Conrad, and Grant, and select OK. Now, those aren't visible like they are in the list box, but whenever the user in runtime is working with the application, they click the down arrow, they'll be able to see that listing. Let's go ahead and run our application real quick to demonstrate this. So when I use the down arrow, notice that Bob, Beth, Conrad, and Grant appear. So this saves us a little bit of space as compared to the list box, which has a fixed area. This has a retractable area, but it only takes up the same amount of space or form factor as a text box on our form. And while I'm thinking about it, here's another tip. Always choose the right input control for the job. For example, use only text boxes when other options won't work. When developing applications, you're typically going to want to steer the user to the right input decision, helping them to avoid spelling mistakes that would cause the application to be confused and possibly crash. So by pre-entering common options, like in the case of the products interested, we put FooBar, BASQuark, those items that are products that our company has for sale, or in the case of service representative, the names of the service representatives that we have. By taking that tact, by that approach, we can reduce the confusion on the part of the user and the application. And again, this is going to make more sense as we work our way through the rest of the lessons, particularly those that involve databases. Okay, continuing on, the next set of controls we want to work with are contained within the menus and toolbars grouping within the toolbox. And so the first thing that we're going to drag and drop onto our design surface is the menu strip. So let's drag it and drop it into place. And notice when we do that, we get a visual representation of our menu at the very top in blue, but we also have this what's called a designer tray at the very bottom that contains our control, the menu strip 1 as it's named by default. And the menu strip allows you to put a drop-down menu within your applications. Now, most Windows applications have a menu with some common items like File and Edit and View and Window and perhaps Help and maybe a few more, perhaps a few less. And this helps users get a grasp on your application quickly because they've used applications like this before. So you can type in a word and use what's provided here, like for example, File. And we can go here and type in new and so forth. Or we can take a little bit of a shortcut if we have just the common items that we need by selecting the menu and then going to the Common Tasks little arrow here and select Insert Standard Items. And by doing that, notice that it inserts File and Edit and Tools and Help. Not only does it insert these items and the sub-items, but it also puts the nice little icons next to them as well, so we don't have to spend a whole lot of time configuring this. And we can continue to modify these, for example, by clicking on it and then adding some sub-elements and things of that nature, inserting breakpoint, little breaks here, for example, and so on. So we may want to then delete this one that we were working on here. So let's click delete, and now we're back to just the common items that were selected. So also I'm going to put something else here in the top. So I'm going to need to crunch some things down here a little bit. And sorry to take the time to do this, but we have to work with things a little bit to get them to look just right. Okay, so the next control that we want to display on our form is a tool strip. And a tool strip is just like a toolbar that we have within our Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition or Office or any of the other applications that you see that are Windows-based. And this is just a simple toolbar that allows us to put visual icons for those tasks that are quick access. So what we can do is just select, for example, button, and then I can click the button and then right-click it and select Set Image, and it gives us this select resource. And what I'm going to do is click on Import, and I have included a file that includes some icons. So from the same spot where you downloaded this video, there should be something called Lesson Resources. Just unzip that and put it somewhere on your hard drive and locate that right now and find, for example, this rss.gif file and click open. And whenever you do, notice that it changes from that default picture icon to this little RSS refresh that we'll use later on in this series of lessons. And once I've done that, I'm going to click the OK button, and now that is a button on my toolbar. But in addition to these typical traditional buttons that we can place on our toolbar, we can also insert things like labels, like this tool strip label, for example. I can change the text to click one of these, or whatever the case might be. I can also place a combo box here. I can also place a progress bar and so on. So I have a lot of options from the tool strip, and they're fully programmable whenever we get into building the rest of our application. Now finally, what we'll want to put onto our little design surface here is a status strip. And a status strip allows us to give feedback to the user, whether through a progress bar or through some type of label that explains that it was saved successfully or deleted successfully from the database. Whatever the case might be, we can give some feedback to the user through the status strip. And we're going to use all these controls, the status strip, the tool strip, the menu strip, within our applications much later in this series of videos. Now there's also one other control that we're not going to demonstrate in this video, but I'll use whenever we're building our RSS Reader application, and that's the tool strip container control that you see over here in the menus and toolbars grouping. And it's a great control. What it does is hosts other controls like the menu strip, the tool strip, the status strip, and so on. So if you've ever used something like Microsoft Word 2003, for example, here, let me bring it up real quick. You can drag anything, whether it's a menu or one of the toolbars, and dock it against, in this case, the left-hand side or at the bottom. You can do the same thing to the menu as well. Doesn't quite work as well, but notice how it orients it like that, or we can put it against the bottom. And that's what the tool strip container will allow us to do. It hosts these other controls like the status bar and the tool strip and the menu strip, and allows us this functionality so that the user can customize the user interface of the application to their liking. So again, we'll demonstrate this when we get into building the RSS Reader much later in the series of lessons. Okay, so we covered some of the basic controls and some of the different ways to set their properties. And we'll come back to these controls several times over the course of the next few lessons in order to illustrate some specific coding concepts. And little by little, you're going to begin to learn even more about these controls and venture into some of the other controls that we haven't talked about yet. But for right now, what I want to do as we begin to close this lesson is talk about some tips and some tricks that we can use within the IDE that will help us get the most out of our experience here. And one of the first things that I want you to be aware of is that you can be accidentally working on the wrong form or the wrong control if you're not careful. So for example, I want to change something about this particular label, and before I select the properties window and change properties, I accidentally click the form. Notice now that the form 1, is what I'm working on. So I start changing the text property, and instead of changing the text property of my form or of my label, I'm changing the text property of my form instead. So that is the little trick that I wanted to suggest, is that make sure that you have the correct control selected and that you're working on that control within the properties window by looking at the currently selected item that's listed underneath the properties window. And if you're having a hard time selecting it, like for example maybe one of the items within the menu, you want to change the name customize to something else, and you're having a hard time selecting that, what you may want to do instead is just drop down this list box and find the control or find the item that you want to work with, in this case maybe label 3, so that you're 100% sure that you're changing the properties of that control as opposed to some other control on your form. Now in this case, notice that when I select label 3, the little caret has now surrounded label 3, and I can be confident that whenever I'm changing its text property or some other property, that's the control that I'm changing, not something else within my form. The next tip is that your users are probably going to want to tab or use the tab key to navigate in a logical sequence from field to field so that they don't have to take their hands off the keyboard in order to enter information on your forms. Now, by default, when you're adding controls to your form, each control is going to be assigned a given tab order, so that the first control that you add will have the tab order of 0, the second control that you add on the form is going to have a tab order of 1, and so on. So if you added things out of order, for example, as I've done at this point, notice what happens whenever I begin to use the tab key on my keyboard. I start at customer name, but now I go to send catalog, and then I go to the gender, whether male or female, then the product interested. It goes in a counterintuitive way through the controls on my form, but I can remedy this by selecting View Tab Order, and now notice that I get this listing of little blue squares, and by selecting those blue squares in the order that I want to be able to allow the user to tab through the controls of my form, it starts at 0 with a white box, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and if I don't want to, I can just ignore the rest of the blue boxes. They're the default order, but not the order that I may want to use. I may not want to tab through the labels, for example. That wouldn't make any sense. So I'm going to now turn off the tab order helper and run the application again. And this time I notice that my cursor automatically goes to customer name, and I'm going to tab through to service representative, product interested in, mail, and then send catalog, OK, cancel, and so on. Okay, so by setting the tab order, you're giving your users an advantage so that they don't have to take their hands off the keyboard, and they're able to use the tab key in order to move in a logical sequence through the controls that are on your form. You're going to generally want to arrange the items on your form to start in the upper left-hand corner and progress in a logical way to the bottom right-hand corner. And the next trick is kind of similar to this, but instead of allowing you to only change the tab order, it allows you to change the same property across all the controls much more quickly than if I were to individually select each control and then move my mouse cursor down to the properties window, find the property, and make the change, and so on. Now, the final tip for this lesson is that there is actually another way to help you line up your controls to make them aesthetically pleasing to your end user. Now, up to this point, you'll remember that we talked about these little guidelines that allowed us to kind of size things up and get things aligned kind of right relative to the other controls that are on the form. But there's actually another neat way to do this, and what I'm going to do is right-click here somewhere in this empty area on my designer, and this gives me a list of all the toolbars that are available for me to use within Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition. The toolbar that I want to enable is the Layout toolbar, and I'm going to click it, which will make it enabled within the IDE. So now you can see it here. And so what I'm going to do is select multiple controls. For example, we'll select, first of all of these controls right here. And what I'm going to do is make sure that they are evenly spaced from each other. So I'm going to select this, make vertical spacing equal. So now there's an equal space between each of the controls. The next thing I'm going to do is align their left-hand side by clicking this button. Okay, and then the next thing that I'll probably wind up doing is going one by one and selecting first the input control, and then holding down the shift button and selecting the label control that accompanies it in order to align their tops. So we'll select that, we'll do this again, and we'll just keep doing this. And notice that the first one that I select has handles that are white, and then all the subsequent ones that I select have handles that are black. And the black ones those are the ones that are going to be changed based on the settings of the one that's selected with the white handles. You'll see this is a pretty dramatic change here whenever we move gender down and so on. And we might want to then also align, let's start over again. Align the tops for these controls and so on. We might want to select then all of our labels and make sure that they are all aligned correctly. For the left-hand side, if I can deselect some of them here, whoops. So we're having a hard time selecting some of these, but we're going to align their lefts. Maybe just move them all over. Maybe that would be better. Okay. So that is the tip. Use the layout control, and there's actually quite a few other options that are available on here as well. I would recommend you go through each of the items and play around with them on your form to kind of see what they do and understand better how they can change the layout of the controls on your form and save you a lot of time rather than playing around with them like I was doing earlier in this video, trying to get everything spaced just right. It's easier to use the layout toolbar. So that's pretty much it for this video. We've talked about quite a few things working with the windows within the Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition IDE. We talked about the controls that are available to our applications, how to set their properties, and also some slightly more advanced techniques for selecting and modifying how those controls are viewed within our application. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please visit www.learnvisualstudio.net to download and watch over 400 videos just like this one aimed at all skill levels on many different topics related to C#, Visual Basic, ASP.NET, and more. Thank you.